Hello everybody and welcome back. Thank you very much for joining me. My name is Deborah Hatswell and you're listening to BBR Investigations. Tonight I'm sharing the second conversation that took place earlier this month between myself and Tom, who, if you remember, is a gentleman who had an awful experience with almost a dozen horrifying creatures at his cottage one warm summer night after hearing the awful wailing cries of a young lady. The cries then became the snarling yawl of some kind of animal. Pulled in two, Tom was faced with a huge dilemma. Should he leave to help the damsel in distress, or remain in the safety of the cottage? Tom opted for the former, and grabbing his shotgun, he emerged from his front door in silence. He crept along to the side gate where he could see into the back garden. He was confronted by the most horrible of creatures, impossible to describe, that came leaping from the trees. The creatures then began to sniff the ground frantically, as if searching for something. One of them becoming ever more bolder as it crept closer and closer to the back door, sniffing at the keyhole. Not knowing what to do, Tom lifted his gun, roared and ran at them, full pelt, and to his surprise, the creatures fled back into the trees they'd emerged from. Thankfully, they've not made an appearance that we know of, as Tom now lives in a different property. Our conversation so far have centred around his previous address at Hale Green Cottage, and Tom said, "All throughout my life, I've experienced the most extraordinary things, and I don't know why. I've asked myself that many times. Why me? What is it about me that enables these things to happen? What did I do to deserve these wonderful things? I've always said to myself that I need to write all of these things down in order to share them with people. I'm an artist and I paint, and I have the type of personality where I can become really focused in on a project, almost obsessively when I'm painting. Several days can go by without me realising. And I was worried that if I started to open up about my experience, I would feel swamped by them all. But talking to you, Deb, has prompted me to finally jot things down. And you did such an amazing job conveying what happened to me at the cottage that I felt comfortable sharing more of my experiences with you. To be honest, I was a little wary when I had to hand things over to you to read out, as I was unsure how you sharing my words would translate. But you did a beautiful job with it. You have a real knack for it, Deb. Seeing those things was one of the worst experiences in my life, and I am loath to paint the creatures I saw, as I'm wary that this may bring about another interaction or entice them back. And there's one experience I had at 17 that was equally as terrifying as seeing those creatures sniffing around the garden of our home. For context, it happened when I visited my girlfriend, who lived in Hastings in a beautiful old house. I asked her a few times if I could come over and stay at her home, and she would say, "I don't think you would like it, Tom." And when I'd ask why, she would tell me, and she'd say that the house was haunted, and it just wouldn't convey how bad things really were there. When I finally visited, it had a profound effect on me, and it's one of the hard things to share. So I prefer to share that at a later date. I thought this time we chatted, we could talk about the cottage, Deb, starting from the earliest days of us moving in. When we finally settled there, it felt like there were so many entities and beings attached to the place. There were some that were really friendly. I can explain what they did, but not what they were. But my instinct put them in the fairy category. They were like little spirits that had the most amazing sense of humour. It was these little folk that would rattle that tin above my head each night so that I'd go soundly off to sleep. They were absolutely naughty and full of fun, and they would often pinch or take brightly coloured items, or interesting things from us, and especially our guests that came to stay in a mischievous way. Our guests would take off their watch or their spectacles at night and place them on the nightstand, and in the morning they'd be gone, and I'd find them in the hornbeam hedge. If you remember, I explained that was where I saw those hellish creatures emerge from. and it was an old live hedge that had been left for so long it grew into the trees, and the older growth from the garden all mingled into one. The old hedge had pockets, and you'd find the missing items there. Sometimes, nestled within the trees or the branches, like baubles or gifts. I would say to our guests, come with me, no doubt we'll find them in the garden area. Over time, it got to be quite embarrassing, as I had a penchant for stealing ladies' knickers. It got to the stage where I had to explain to people that the goldy underwear was not being stolen or left adorning the trees by me. And to be honest, I loved them for it. The energy and the feelings of the playful mischief, it was welcomed by me. There were also spirits of people in the cottage, and a number of psychics had visited us over the years. One particular lady, who was quite famous, visited us once, and she had been to many haunted places before. And she came into the lounge and sat down on the sofa, and she put her head in her hands and started to shake. And she kept repeating, I can't do this. It's too much. There are too many things trying to come through. And she got up from the sofa, clearly alarmed, and left. On another occasion, a different lady came over after contacting me, and she was in agreement that there were lots of different things at play at the cottage. One of the things previous tenants had experienced was the sound of bounding footsteps that would come walking up the path to the cottage door. And then there would be a series of loud, hefty bangs on the wall. At that time, I lived at another property about a mile up the lane, and a young couple lived in the cottage then. It was quite often that the young lady would be at home alone when her husband was at work, and she was at the sink, maybe doing her washing up. She'd start to hear the footsteps, and then she'd hear the bangs on the wall, and she'd be so shaken up that she'd just leave. She would lock up and walk a mile to our house and ask if she could stay with us until her husband was back later in the evening. Well, the psychic that visited picked up on this and explained that she could sense a man who was dressed in clothes of an early to mid-century attire. He looked like a game warden or a groundskeeper, and he was carrying a shotgun, and he would walk down the path. She described his dirty clothes, his thick woolen socks that his trousers were tucked into, and the boots on his feet were heavy and thickly caked in clay. She went into great detail and explained that the man was kicking below the cottage window, and at first she wasn't sure what he was kicking at or why, until she realised he was kicking the heavy clay off his boots. She felt that this activity was residual in essence, and the young girl who lived there was, no doubt hearing him going about his daily routine, returning home from his day in the fields and the woodlands. He was removing the thick clay before he came indoors. And then he would enter and walk up the stairs of the cottage, which gave us a clue to the identity for one of the spirits in this place. But there were many more. When I moved into the cottage, Deb, I experienced all this myself. You would hear the thump, thump, thump of feet coming up the stairs, and you'd wait for the bedroom door to open and someone to come into the room. But it never happened. There would be a complete silence, and then it would start again on a loop. One funny thing to mention was the footsteps always came up the stairs, never down. It would just repeat over and over like that. It happened so often, we just got used to it. It was when we had our son that we noticed he was being cared for by someone unseen. Do you remember me telling you, Dad, that the cottage sits on an old horse farm, and there were two sisters who worked the farm, looked after their father and their grandfather? Well, they all lived very happily here, and I am convinced it was those ladies that would soothe and look after our son. The ladies were from a travelling family that settled in the area, and as far as we know, they never married and they didn't have children of their own. When our son was first born, for about a year afterwards, he was comforted by them. The way the cottage was set up meant that at the top of the staircase there was a V, and that separated the two main rooms in the house. One was ours, and the other was the second bedroom that had become our son's room. Sometimes we would hear him start to stir as he woke up, And as myself or my ex-wife would go to get up, you'd hear the noise of his cradle rocking, as if someone had gone into him and settled him back down again, enabling us to have an extra few minutes in the morning. The first time I heard it, I mistakenly thought he had somehow found a way to rock the cradle himself. I kept listening, and you could hear him gurgling as he would if it was me or his mum that had gone in to settle him. He was interacting with something or someone that he liked. I thought I'd better go in and see what was up, and he was fine, but his baby grow had been popped open some. Over time, we'd find him with his baby grow open or, with a fresh nappy on. We once found him with his baby grow upside down on his head, with the legs hanging down like little bunny ears. It took us quite a while to work it out, but we eventually felt it was the two ladies who were enjoying looking after him. You could tell that he loved it. He would gurgle and laugh as he played with him. I think they didn't know how to put on a baby grow, as they were not that kind of in fashion back in their day. Babies would wear a Liberty bodice and that had like little fabric ribbons or ties. To be honest, it was lovely to see, and he was so happy as a child growing up there. Sadly, the cottage was getting older and older and needed repairing more and more, so we couldn't stay. I had to move to another home. I hung on for as long as I could. Eventually, the inevitable happened, and we found our new home. There was a remarkable difference in my son's behaviour at our new place, as he would cry more, or he'd be unsettled as his routine had changed, and there were no pleasant visitors in his room. Myself and Tom chatted for a while about the cottage and the visitors who would flit in and out at will, and we both believed some of the activity was just old owners of the cottage that liked to visit from time to time. We also chatted about the extensive iron mining in the area that had gone on for hundreds of years, and we both theorised that the destruction this brought to the land and the area may also play into the activity taking place there. For me, it feels like something brooding and ancient that Tom and some of the other locals are experiencing. The mining brought people from all across the UK, and in the autumn months and at harvest, these people would also work the fields. People were far more connected to the land then, and there were many of them would be hunting, trapping, fishing, foraging to fill the larders through the seasons. They would also bring with them their culture, their traditions, and their stories from home. And it was the same for my ancestors when they'd travel all over the country selling horses and cattle, meeting up with relatives you hadn't seen in a while. It was also where most of them met their future wives and husbands, swapped family stories, and asked after old friends. An idyllic escape from the smog-bound city. You worked in the fields in the day, and you made hay when the sun shone. And then they would enjoy themselves around the fire, sharing updates from home. They'd also play their music and dance in the moonlight until time for bed. Tom said, as soon as the harvest was ready to be picked, people would come from all across the county, from far and wide, and they'd set up temporary homes. With that, the area would become like a bustling shanty town. There'd be people fixing and mending, others would be selling their wares, baked goods, preserves, ribbons, cloth. For the working folk, this was as close to a holiday as you get back then. Around November time, you could hear these huge banging noises that would sound out across the valley. And there was this huge hill across the stream that was called Gun Hill. And the story goes that due to all of the iron that was pulled from this mill, was made mostly for cannons, that during the Battle of Trafalgar, both sides were using cannons made with Sussex iron. The noises would start up as the evening drew in, and it was said that the din was like the sound of corrugated iron that was being banged together, making an incredible series of bangs that rang out across the valley. But not everyone would hear it, and the ones that did said it was the old ironworkers coming back. It was said that they would use the hill as a place to test fire the cannons, hence the name Gun Hill. But in Old English, gun, spelt Gwyn, means king of the fairies or king of the underworld, and it is a really strange place. There are no houses up there, and we would sometimes walk up it, as there was an old bottle dump situated at the top. The hill was thick with holly bushes, and the higher you climbed, the harder it became to breathe. Now, this was nothing to do with altitude, as with each step you took, you'd feel more and more breathless, to the point it would become scary, until you got to the top, and then the feeling would pass. I was up there one day with my dog, and I headed up to check out the bottle dump. On the other side of the hill, there were fields filled with corn, so it must have been around June. It was a lovely sunny day too, and it was during the afternoon, and my dog, who was a Springer Spaniel, shot off into the fields. I could see she was working the fields, trying to flush out a pheasant or two. And suddenly, she came rushing back out of the corn, her tail between her legs, and she was so scared, she tried to fold herself into the smallest shape that she could. In the next moment, I saw two dogs appear from the corn. They were enormous, with the bodies of, say, a lurcher, but much bigger, and they were more the size of a wolf. They had long snouts, and they were stunning to look at. Their fur was long and glossy. One was jet black, and the other was snow white, and I realised they were walking towards me, and they stopped and stared at me, and I felt a strong feeling that I needed to go. I watched as they walked backwards into the corn and disappeared. I believed that they were fairy dogs, and we'd intruded. I felt a polite but strong urge to leave, so that's what I did. I have never forgotten those dogs and the feeling they evoked in me that day. They were a beautiful sight to look at, and I do feel blessed to have seen them. I was really interested in the holly trees that Tom mentioned that line the hill. As we know, holly's a favourite of the fairy folk. The holly is used as protection for the fae, and a staff made of holly could bring many blessings. I myself have a holly stick that was made for me by a witness who I helped many years ago. I treasure that stick, and it's always brought me good luck. I take it when I go to a new woodland, just to be on the safe side, as you never know the pedigree of the land beneath your feet. The magical properties of the holly is mentioned in folklore from all across the British Isles, and one particular tale has stuck with me over the years, and that's from the Suffolk region. On June the 17th, 1499, in Norwich, John and Agnes Clark and their daughter Marion appeared before a church court accused of sorcery. The family lived in Great Ashfield in Suffolk, where their daughter had developed a reputation as a healer, a soothsayer, and a finder of buried treasure. Marion immediately confessed everything, as she had done no wrong. She admitted that the fairies helped her whenever she needed information. Amongst their assistants was a holly stick that they'd given her. Her mother had taken it to church on Palm Sunday, mixed it in with the palm fronds to be blessed, and Marion then used the stick to find treasure. Even in modern times, holly is planted close to homes as it is a very good lightning conductor. Now, there are also many folklore tales from across the world that feature two dogs, one which is black and one which is white. One popular tale tells the story of how a dog saved Ireland from a giant monstrous creature with flaming eyes that ate rotten flesh, including human body parts, and was partial to men's hands and feet and their upper body. According to the tale, the giant serpent was terrorising Ireland's people, and no one could stop it. And one day a brave dog stepped forward and confronted the serpent. The dog fought bravely against the creature and eventually killed it. And this act of bravery saved Ireland from the serpent's reign. Thankfully, the dog seen by Tom seemed to only want to move him from the area, and they offered no malice or threat. Tom said, "Seeing something like that's a privilege, and throughout my life I've had many experiences that have been magical, I suppose, but I have had some events that have been really terrifying. The experience I had when I was 17 was so evil, I don't even like to talk about it. I'll tell you more about it later, Deb, as it's still a really hard event for me to share. I saw this thing at my girlfriend's home, and what happened was so bad, so negative, that it could physically make you sick. It was not something I want anyone to go through, but it did have the opposite effect on me in some way. I realised after that event that if something like that can exist, something dark and negative and brooding, then the opposite must be true. That beings that are positive and light must exist also. It was proof to me, even at that young age, that there was always entities around you that can be light or dark. To me, it was a revelation, and it enabled me to walk away from that dark, evil thing. Tom said there would always be good to counterbalance the bad. That event was like conversion therapy. Facing that and moving forward enabled me to concentrate on the beautiful side of things. So in a funny kind of way, I could almost thank the awful thing I'd seen. Tom said, I found peace in myself because I encountered evil. I want to touch on Tom's message, as I too have found a positive from an awful situation. Seeing what I saw as a teenager had a terrible effect on me, and I was so scared it left me in a constant state of fight. Even now, I'm not an easy person to rise. On my recent visit to hospital, the nurses quickly learned not to wake me suddenly, as I'd go instantly into fight mode. I've had so many pills over the years to stop this, but none of them have worked. I didn't know at the time all of that would turn out really well for me. It strengthened my character, gave me a unique insight into the paranormal realm, or whatever we're calling it these days. My upbringing and heritage became tools rather than millstones. The day I realised that there's good and bad in all things, I stopped fearing the bad. My experience became lighter and formed teaching moments, and now I can hold back the negative when needed. And I believe Tom will agree it's the same for him. He said, many years later, when I lived at the cottage, we'd often have strange animals turn up out of the blue. And one day it was a beautiful peacock, and he stayed with us for years. I kept free-range chickens, and they'd wander where they wanted. And when the peacock turned up, he'd herd the chickens together. He was a character. His favourite thing to do was sit on top of the house, on top of the TV aerial, and he'd swoop away on it until he saw a car coming down the lane, and then he would swoop down right across the top of the car and terrify the occupiers. He actually caused 3 crashes doing this. Another time we had a white fantail dove just appear from nowhere, and they went to roost in the eaves of the cottage. They were absolutely beautiful birds. There was one time I decided to expand my coop to bring in a bit of revenue, and I bought some very rare breed eggs and put them under my bantams to hatch. The birds were all in cages scattered around the garden, and they suddenly began to get eaten. Something was taking the chicks and killing the bantams. I couldn't work out what was doing this, so I set out to catch the culprit. When I finally saw it, I realised it was a silver mink, and it had burrowed into the ground in order to get to the chicks. Now, there were a lot of dark mink down on the riverbanks, and they could be a nuisance. Wild mink are dark in colour, and it's supposed to be almost impossible for them to be silver in colour, but this was. The silver pelt is very sought after, and many breeders keep them for this reason. Yet when the minks escape, their pelts will naturally turn to their dark colour. This silver devil destroyed 7 or 8 runs in a matter of 48 hours. I just couldn't stop it. I tried to hit it with a shovel, and it just jumped out of the way. I wasn't sure if this thing was flesh and blood, to be honest, as it always evaded my efforts. One evening I had a friend over, and the mink was making noises somewhere, as I could hear crashing and banging sounds. The friend who was with me was a farmer, and we both got out our shotguns, and by then the mink had made its way into the main hen house. I used my torch, and you could see it as it killed a chicken, and it crawled inside the body. Its head was covered in blood, and what was weirder, it was singing. It was making a weird, wailing, crooning noise, and it came out of the body of the chicken and raised up onto its hind legs. It was horrible to look at, all covered in blood and wailing and yowling, and then it began to sway slowly from side to side, and my friend shouted, "For God's sake, shoot it." But I couldn't. I actually said, "I can't. It won't let me." I was completely transfixed on it. It felt like this animal had taken me over somehow, preventing me from shooting it. It held my gaze to the point my friend slapped me and I fired the shot. It was one of the weirdest things I've ever seen, and throughout it made that horrible crooning, wailing noise. I don't want to think about what would have happened if I'd been alone that night. I'm so glad that my friend was with me. You know, he's farmed his whole life, and even he was shocked by this thing. I will never forget the sound that creature made. It'll stay with me forever. Another weird event that you might find interesting is something that happened when I had some friends waiting outside the cottage for me. Back then, I was really into my motorbikes, I still am, and I'd ride with a group of friends. We'd often go out together over the weekend, and this particular week, I was the last one to be ready, which isn't unusual for me, as I do have a habit of always being the last one out of the door. I was popping in and out of the cottage for things I wanted to bring that I'd forgotten. And as I left on my final visit, I went out, got on my bike, waited for my ex-wife, who would be riding pillion with me. I felt two hands on my shoulders. I felt the wake of the bike shift as she climbed on. So I asked if she was ready, and I set off down the lane. I drove for about a mile, and I suddenly realised that the bike was really light. And I turned to look at her, and she wasn't on the bike. My first thought was, oh God, no, she's fallen off the back. So I immediately turned the bike around, and I was looking for her in my headlights along the lane, but I couldn't find her anywhere. I made it all the way back to the cottage. I realised all of my friends were still there, looking perplexed at my strange behaviour. In fact, they asked, "What are you doing?" They asked why I'd left without my ex-wife, and I explained that I thought she was on the back. I felt the suspension lower when she climbed on. I was completely confused. I must have looked crazy just driving off like that. I was absolutely convinced someone was on the bike with me. Not long after this, someone took a photograph of me on the bike, and there was a figure sitting behind me. He had on a big old trench coat, and his face looked like a bird. He had a thick beard, and his nose was very long and pointed, like a big beak, so much so that I took to calling him the Birdman. I'll see if I can find the old image, and if I do, I'll share it with you, Deb. We didn't talk about portals in those days, but I'm convinced that that's what's happening in Chidingley. I would describe it in such a way as there is a tear or a rip there in our reality, and things are enabled to slip through. I think some of those things disguise themselves as the good things, but they really are not. One night that still confuses me involves an event I find very hard to explain. We were used to the noise of invisible feet on the stairs in the cottage, and we became so used to it that it became the norm. But one night I heard something start to climb the stairs, and this was different. I felt a change in myself, and I took note of that. I asked my wife if she heard the footsteps, and she agreed that she had. I told her something's off, and this is not the same thing, and I think this has malice in mind. The night of this ominous footsteps coincided with a knife that I'd recently purchased. I love to collect interesting antiques, and I had bought a curved Arabic knife with an intricate silver meshed sheath. The guy who sold it me explained that I wouldn't be able to remove the knife as it had been stuck in the sheath for as long as he knew. I took it home, and I did manage to remove it from the sheath, but I cut myself doing so, and it caused me to bleed. Within 2 days of bringing it home, the weird, oppressive footsteps started. The night, as I lay in bed, I knew what was coming was something I would have to face. I was really concerned, as you could feel a brooding malice coming up the stairs. As I steeled myself, the bedroom door opened with a whoosh of wind, and you couldn't see it, but something came charging into our room. It was big and heavy, and I jumped out of bed, and somehow I found myself fighting a foe I couldn't see. We were physically wrestling, pushing each other in, a battle of wills. And I'm shouting at it to leave. And as suddenly as it came, it vanished. I looked over at my ex-wife, and she was completely out of it. She was on the bed, staring off into space and talking loudly, repeating the words, washing machine, washing machine, washing machine. It was absolutely bizarre. I can only presume this was her brain trying to protect her in an act of distraction by repeating something really ordinary in a way as to hold off the brooding visitor. I had to shake her to bring her out of the trance. That event was really scary, and I can still remember having to physically fight this thing. Thank goodness I was able to overpower it. Later, after myself and my ex-wife had parted ways, I was still living in the cottage alone. On one lovely evening, I was on my own and I was going down to a friend's house that lives about 3 miles away. That evening, I had driven my bike down to the pub to meet up with a few friends. One of the pub regulars was much older than us. He was a lovely bloke, real country eccentric. Every day he'd cycle to the pub, get absolutely sloshed, and then cycle back home again. Everyone liked him and he was a lovely chap. The locals would look out for him and make sure he got home safe. I never heard a bad word from him until that night. The pub was crowded, and when he saw me, he made a beeline straight for me. I leant my ear forward so I could hear him over the chatter, and he did the strangest thing. He looked me dead in the eye, put his hands on both of my shoulders, and as he did that, his face contorted into an awful sneer. He looked really strange, and I asked him, "What's the matter? What's wrong?" And he put his face right up to mine and snarled, "You think you're fucking Jesus Christ, don't you?" I kept repeating to him that it's just me, it's just Tom. He muttered something and skulked off into the crowd. We drank up, and I went to my friend's place, which is closer to the pub than mine. I stayed till about 1 a.m, and then I set off for home. It was a lovely night, and I was enjoying the drive home as I followed the lane as it winds in and out between the fields and the woods. There came a point when I noticed a bright light coming towards me down the lane. I thought it was a car that was having trouble with its headlights. As it passed, I had slowed down to a crawl, and the car almost blinded me, so I was having trouble seeing. I felt completely out of sorts. I was dizzy and confused, and I crawled to a stop. I kept telling myself to keep it together. I started to feel stranger and stranger. I had both feet on the ground at this point, and I'm walking the bike with the engine going. The next thing I knew, I was on the ground, and I'd fallen over, and I was trapped beneath the bike. I was paralysed somehow, and I remember thinking, "Come on, Tom, pull yourself together." I was losing consciousness, and my last thought was that I was in a really dangerous situation here. If a car came along the lane, out there people drive whenever speed they want, and due to the bends in the road, they wouldn't see me until it was too late, and then I passed out. The next thing I knew, I was coming to, sitting on my stairs in the cottage. It was as if I'd just fallen asleep there on the stairs. I still had my leather jacket on. I remember thinking, hold on, how did I get here? How did I get home? Another friend of mine was passing, and seeing the light on in the cottage chalet, he called in to make sure I was okay, and I told him what had happened. I didn't know where the bike was, and all I could remember was willing myself home as I was passing out. I can still feel how desperate I felt lying there in the road like that. We both set off up the lane to look for my bike, which was nowhere to be seen. We walked up and down looking for it. Now there's a small pull-off along the lane, which is a really small path, but I checked that anyway, and that's where I found my bike. It was down the small path leaning on a gate. I don't know how it got there or why. It was all muddy, and you could see it had been pushed in here and left for me to find. I could not work out what happened that night. I was in complete state of confusion. So I convinced myself someone had come along, found me in the road, brought me home, collected my bike, and pushed it down the little path and landed it on a fence. Another thing was my helmet. I've never found that. It's still missing to this day. No doubt that was incredibly confusing for Tom. He was in certain danger, left unconscious in the lane like that. Country roads wind, very tight corners, and they're mostly bordered by hedgerows or stone walls. So any vehicle coming along would have been on top of Tom before they realised. I think a combination of things happened that night. Tom was being looked after, but I don't know by whom. A guardian that didn't reveal itself to Tom came to his rescue. Missing time and a constant feeling of the unknowing was the price he had to pay. How did he get home and into the cottage? And who moved the bike and why? And we must not forget that Tom literally willed himself to safety. Us humans have a tremendous inner strength at times, but this will is on another level entirely. Self-preservation can tap into our ancient selves, the inner private beings, the primal ones, who know everything that we're capable of doing. Beings not tied down by society's constant distraction and oppression. The beings we used to be. The tie to that is stronger in some of us than others, and it is a unique situation to all. But this situation, Tom's life was saved. But for me, the bigger question is, what was the light that Tom saw in the lane that he felt was a car? It was as the light passed him that he was overcome with the dizzying nausea that made him pass out. Today we'd probably call it a light being, or a plasma entity of the UFO kind. But fairy lights have been seen since the dawn of time. Some inviting you into dark forests, always slightly out of your touch, enticing you to go further and further in. Not all of the Fae are positive beings. Some are mischievous, some are downright mean, and the worst kind are evil. They will mimic and imitate into whatever shape or form that will draw you in. The skipping child who laughs as she goes off into the fields, that you feel the compelling urge to follow, can be the brownest of boggans intent on harm. The white lady who walks the stairs, ever gliding and regal, can become the most evil of crones. As Tom found out at 17, there is a balance to everything. So I must mention the horrible ones, the misunderstood, the snarled and the bruised, who are as gentle as a leaf. We can't see it, so we don't feel it. But some of us don't. I've dealt with people and beings who look like the monsters of our dreams, and yet they've come to the rescue of many. They have used their presence, their will and strength to save our souls. Yet to look on them is incredibly hard. But if you can, you'll start to see their ugliness as a beauty all of its own. Where there is dark, then there shall be light. I think the key to Tom and his connection to the cottage is all wrapped up with that. He was meant to be there. He's like the elderly bar too, which is a respectful term for an older gentleman held in high regard in Romani, a man who previously lived at the cottage. He had a vital role to play in the balance between dark and light, as does Tom. Tom felt only positive things in his time at the cottage, and on the whole, life was good, and his interactions were good. But on one or two occasions, something awful had come through, and he hadn't managed to fight that off. And, still somehow gone on to protect and prosper. I don't know what would have happened the night the hellish creatures came through the trees if Tom hadn't scared them off. They were patrolling that garden, sniffing and searching. They came through a tear in our reality, right into Tom's. Others may have feared that cottage from the first day, and then the energy would become constantly negative. And each fear, feeds that being, becoming ever more so. I didn't mention it to Tom at the time, but the two dogs he saw in the field that were jet black and snow white have a meaning for me. In fact, it's something I've only shared with a few people. But as a child, I would see horribly weird, wolf-like, rabid, snarling dogs in my room as a child, and they'd bite and snap at my legs and my feet, and I'd be bunched up in a corner of my room, as small as I could get, on my bed, terrified. Someone taught me how to shrink those feeds down small, and I'd blow them away like ash on the wind. And that'd work for a while, but they'd come back eventually, and they'd be bigger and fiercer and scarier than ever. It never stopped, and it still happened up until my late 40s. It didn't stop until I heard the story of the two wolves. The tale goes that many moons ago, a brave young man went to his chief and declared his confusion between good and evil. He told his chieftain that there were two wolves fighting within him. One was black as the night and made him do horrible things. It would influence his actions, no matter how hard he tried to fight it off. And then there was the white wolf, too small to be heard, that could help him see the good in things and change his ways. And those two wolves were fighting over him. He was terrified of what that result of that battle would be, and he asked the chief which wolf would win. And the chief turned to him and said, "The wolf that wins is the wolf you feed." A few nights after hearing this, my dark wolves were back, and I was dreaming of them chasing me, getting closer and closer to my heels. So in my dream, I picked up my skirts, kicked off my shoes, and I ran like the wind across the moor. I was skipping and outrunning them for the first time ever, and I crested the top of a tall hill. I was gasping for breath, and sitting there was a white wolf, and she was beautiful. I saw blue eyes as deep as the earth, and she turned to me and said, "It's time to stop running, child. Take your place." And since that night, my dark wolves have almost vanished. I see a glimpse of them sometimes, way out there in the distance, skulking, always looking for a way in. But my white wolf is so strong now that their efforts are futile. Isn't that what Tom's message is? Concentrate on the positive, and the negative will start to fade away. Tom shared with me that from time to time, little round rolling stones could be heard in the cottage. He'd hear them landing upstairs in the bedrooms. Tom said, from time to time, there would be these little round stones, Debbie, that would appear, and you could hear them as they hit the floor upstairs. We'd rush upstairs and open the door, and as we did so, a rushing wind would come past us, and in the middle of the floor there would be a small stone, or stones like marbles. But one time we found a stone that was so big it nearly came through the floorboards. I saw them as amazing little gifts, and I couldn't work out where the stones came from, as most of the land here is old iron, slag or clay. The stones we found resemble pebbles that you would find on the beach, and I have no idea where they originated from. As humans have an affinity for stones, don't we? Not a visit to the woods or the beach goes by that I don't pick up a stone that calls me. In fact, I've so many I've put them in my borders, as there are far too many for me to keep beside the house anymore. Each stone is a little memory of a place I've been, how I felt when I was there. Some girls like diamonds, but one Mark surprised me with a stone brick that was used in the stables at Buell Hill, where my life changed in 82, as they were being torn down to make way for a modern garden centre. And it sits proudly amongst my collection. Stones are tactile, and they feel different in your hand. They can be used as runes or as talismans, predicting the future. They're used as amulets, to ward off evil. Tom's wife told me about an experience that happened to her one day when they were out walking, and I will bring you that account and others from Tom as he starts to feel better. Now, as you know, Tom's had some health troubles of his own recently, but he's now home from hospital and he's recovering well. I have to say, talking with Tom brought me so much joy. He's the type of a man who can see a rainbow in a thunderstorm. He is incredibly positive and views any negative situation with a wise eye. Even with his sickness, as we chatted, Tom shared with me that having his operation has given him a new lease on life, and he feels far stronger than he has in years. The battle between positive and negative has been explained in Tom's experiences, and that is an important lesson. And I think that's what I'd like to end on tonight. No matter where you are in life, and no matter how hard things seem, there is always a plan in place, and positive things are on the way. I often tell my daughters that the hard situation sent as an obstacle can be a liberation in disguise if you look at it with a different eye. Like Tom, I've had my own health scares recently, and each one of them has given me a host of problems that in reality were just steps I needed to take on a path. Experiences are sent to teach us, and sometimes what feels like an unsurmountable odds are in reality a huge liberation. As we reach the time of the year when the veil is at its thinnest, no doubt some of you out there will have experiences of your own. Try to heed Tom's words when you do. Reach out if you need to, or speak to a friend, or contact us here at BBR. I share cases like this every week, and I'm sure there'll be something that you will enjoy. So until next time, good night, everyone.